Stress is load, strain is length. So stress is measured on the y-axis is measured in newtons. Strain is measured in millimeters. The distance, it's the length. Let me grab a TheraBand while I'm talking. What's missing from this graph is time. There's no time on here. And I don't know about you, but I haven't discovered how to get rid of time. Otherwise, my eyes would be a little less puffy and a little higher on my face. But time, I can't get rid of time. So because time is missing from this, in reality, when we're dealing with biomechanics like human life, it is simply a model, and it's an incomplete model. The TheraBand doesn't care about time. The TheraBand might dry out over time, but that's not a function of stress and strain over time. That's a function of the material changing because of atmosphere and stuff, But because this doesn't have cells that turn it over, it doesn't age. It might break down, biodegradable time, but it doesn't age the way people do, right? So not that the stress strain curve has anything to do with age, but I'm just saying as soon as we apply this model, which is a material science model, to bio, so it's a mechanics model. When we attach it to biomechanics, we have to acknowledge its limitations because biology doesn't act this way, which is why viscoelasticity is so important. That's where all the answers are. But you can't understand viscoelasticity unless you understand this graph. Because what this graph does is it expresses to you the relationship between stress and strain. And the relationship between stress and strain in this graph is linear. Linear as in, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Linear as in right here, this elastic region. But once again, biology isn't truly linear. So again, it's just expressing to you this relationship. And what that means is that for every unit of stress, you get a unit of strain. And technically, it's actually the opposite. For every unit of strain, every millimeter that I stretch a connective tissue, I get a unit of resistance stress. So it's not that I'm applying a stress, which I am applying a stress, but it's more that it's resisting so it holds its own potential energy when it's stressed. It's resisting me. That's the technical way. Doesn't matter if you say for a unit of stress, I get a unit of strain. Doesn't make a difference. But I want you to, have the proper understanding. So that means that that along that slope, along that linear region, what we get is an equal ratio. It doesn't change. So if it's like 2-to-1, it's 2-to-1 the whole way. And that's just the mathematical model or the mathematical relationship of a linear graph. And if you remember from college algebra, y equals mx plus b, you can plot the points, x being the horizontal axis, y being the top axis. And when you solve for m, you get a slope. And the slope is expressed in the stiffness. So a stiffer TheraBand that requires more force per unit would look like, draw blue, perfect, would look like this. That would be a stiff segment, or stiff tissue, I should say. And let me do the green TheraBand. The compliant would look like this. So that would be the difference between these two, compliant and this one just tore. Ignore that. And stiff, because that's not what actually happens. Your connective tissue doesn't do that. What you should notice, however, about this graph is that what doesn't change is this line. So that means that the length aspect doesn't change. It's not that you can get longer for more load. Like you can get longer for more load. You can't just get longer, period. You get longer, you get more load relative to the length. So here it's like a stiff tissue, whatever the length is, let's say it's, 5% of its length, right? The green tissue has less load or less resistance, and the blue tissue has more load and more resistance for the same length. But the thing is, they both stretch. They both can get long. So when people think that stiff has to do with range of motion or compliance has to do with range of motion, it doesn't, because they both can touch their toes. It's just one has more resistance stress. And as a result, that stiffness will correlate with its elasticity. And elasticity, I think people think means more flexible. I see it on social media all the time. Elasticity has everything to do with recoil, to return to its resting length. So our tissues are, when they're elastic, the more elastic a tissue, the stiffer it is, because it has more recoil and more resistance. And ultimately, it's better for force transmission. And that's what this tissue does. That's its job. And when you look at this graph and you're blinded by range of motion, you're missing what it's telling us, right? It's not telling us how flexible we are. It's telling us how good it is at transmitting force. And the example that I give is, if I wanted to move my couch, which one would I tie around the couch and pull on? The compliant one or the stiff one, right? If I'm the muscle and these are the tendon and the couch is the bone that needs to be moved, I'd have to pull really hard and the couch wouldn't go very far. But with this one, it would go much further, and a rope would be even better. But we don't need ropes in our tissue. That wouldn't work. So it's not the perfect analogy, but it does express to you what I mean by force transmission, right? Okay, that's that area. The yield point is the end of the elastic region. After that, we have this plastic region where it's no longer linear. Do you see that? It actually, it's now curved. And actually, the further strain we get, the actually less stress it can take. It goes down instead of up and to the right. That is for material failure. And sure enough, you'll go into a material science lab and they'll have a seat belt, for example, and they'll pull on it 80,000 times before it fails, because they need to know what it can tolerate to pass certain safety measures. But our tissue is not like that, because it has cells. So it's not like you only have 80,000 forward folds in you before you have your tendons are like worn out socks. It doesn't work that way, because our cells actually respond and build stuff up. Also, we don't stretch in normal human movement to that length, those plastic region lengths. I can't bend my elbow anymore. It doesn't go there. You know what I mean? I put my belly on my thighs. That's the end of my range of motion. I can't bend my knee any further. So normal human movement is around 2 to 6% elongation, which is like this region, right? It's like this mid-elastic region. Extreme situations, maybe where you're doing the splits on 2 chairs and you're talking about the posterior inferior hip capsule, maybe we can get some stuff happening there, maybe, but most people don't do that. So normal human movement just kind of fits into this elastic region in general. Okay, that being said, as soon as you add a time variable, everything changes. And the time variable can be anything from frequency, duration, acceleration, velocity. All of these things have time. If you look at what their component parts are, if you look at the units, they all have a unit of time in there. And so it's like things change a little bit. And that's where you have to kind of study the viscoelastic stuff that's in my chapter 3. The one that I'm going to give an example of right now is strain rate sensitivity. Things act stiffer when you're loading them faster. So that's why you don't tear an ACL walking down the street. You tear an ACL changing directions rapidly. Most of these injuries are rapid loading. So one thing to do a stretch, it's another thing to have someone jump on you while you're stretching. You're going to have different reactions. That's just one of the viscoelastic phenomena. There's many. Creep is another one. You you can get more loose and it's not really compliant. It's really creep, but it would act like a compliant tissue temporarily if you're in a long passive stretch for a long time, but then it will spring back and become normal again. That's just like a viscoelastic phenomena. And then the last part that I should talk about is the toe region. And the toe region is this inverted curve. So you see how here we have this curve and here we have this curve. It's the opposite direction. And that is because the collagen fibers, when they're at rest, they have this crimp. They're like they have an amplitude, like up the sound wave, think of. And so when you first initiate a movement or you first put tension on the tissue, that crimp sort of flattens out a little bit. And then you go into the elastic range. It's still under tension with that amplitude. The tissue is always under tension. So it's not like my TheraBand. I just can't crimp the TheraBand and keep it under tension because it's not collagen. It's it's elastic, right? So it's not a good analogy. But the amplitude, and there's some really interesting research that's way beyond my scope or interest, importantly, my interest. But, a lot of the performance measures the crimp will adjust because it affects how it lengthens and yields. But not something we're not measuring people's crimp under a microscope and adjusting our yoga practice accordingly. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, that was 15 minutes. Does anyone have any follow-up questions? I gotten pretty good at this, huh? And when I first used to lecture it, it was like, it was a little bit messy, but I feel like I've given this lecture 800 times. Juliet, did that help you?
Yeah, actually, it was great to hear it separate from other information. Really. And
yeah,
I haven't been back to it for a while, and I'm getting back to your book, and I thought that would be my starting point. So I really appreciate it. Yeah.
So now when you go and look at viscoelasticity, now you're recognizing that the stress strain curve isn't real per se. It's just helping you understand these relationships. So when you look at viscoelasticity, now we usually have, strain on one axis and time on the other, and stress is constant. And so now you can start to see how things play out. I think the stress strain curve is a learning tool to understand relationships between variables. If I wanted to make this real, I would put a z-axis coming off my screen with time on it, and then I would put another axis coming off my screen at another angle with sex on it, male or female, and then I would put another axis with, training history. And all of a sudden I would have a 50-dimensional graph can you read a 50-dimensional graph with any confidence? Do you know what I'm saying? So the 2-dimensional linear relationship is to express something, but not the full picture.